Good afternoon and welcome for joining us today. Our featured guest is Laura Elliott, and she'll be presenting on Richard R. Kirkland, the Angel of Marye's Heights in Historiography and Memory. Laura Elliott is an independent and published historian and researcher whose primary interest is Kershaw's division of Longstreet's Corps. A family connection sparked her initial interest in Wofford's Georgia Brigade, and her research has gradually expanded to include all 4 brigades of that understudied division. She enjoys historical research and has always been very generous in sharing her findings with others. Her research has been utilized by the Library of Congress, the Alabama Department of Archives and History, the South Carolina Library, Manassas National Battlefield, and other historians and institutions. Laura hosts a virtual weekly series for CivilWarTalk.com that features historians, authors, and collectors. She lives near Gadsden, Alabama, and hopes to utilize her 10+ years of research to write a regimental history of the 16th Georgia Infantry. But today she's here to share her latest on Sergeant Richard Rowland Kirkland, better known as the Angel of Marye's Heights. Laura has mined previously unutilized resources that shed new light on his inspirational and iconic event. And please join me in welcoming Laura Elliott.
Thank you so much, Diane, for that introduction and warm welcome. And thanks for the invitation to be here today to share this research. It's a great opportunity, and I appreciate so much everyone who's in attendance today taking the time to be here. It's good to see so many familiar faces in the audience. And many thanks to Mac Wyckoff for agreeing to review this presentation and provide his input and expertise. For those of you who may not be familiar with Mr. Wyckoff's work, he's retired from the National Park Service now, and he's also the author of A History of the 2nd South Carolina Infantry, 1861 to 1865, and A History of the 3rd South Carolina Regiment, Lee's Reliables, as well as many articles and manuscripts. Mr. Wyckoff has dedicated over 25 years of research to the study of Kershaw's brigade. He is the preeminent expert on the Kirkland incident and the foremost authority on Kershaw's brigade. I'm so incredibly honored that he would agree to do this, to review this research. Thank you so much, Mr. Wyckoff. And also, before we get started, I wanted to say a special thanks to Dennis Gallahan for his partnership and assistance on this research, this entire project, really. He's kind of served as a sounding board for me and reviewed research and then spent untold number of hours, boots on the ground, reconciling accounts with the actual ground. He lives there in the area. It's been an amazing adventure, and Dennis's help has been invaluable. Of course, I'd like to be able to name everyone who's helped with this project, including some of you there in the audience that I see. Thank you so much. You guys know who you are. I'm not going to name each and every one and thank them individually, but I do appreciate all your help and assistance. Like I said, many thanks to everybody who's helped. As Diane mentioned in the introduction, I'm not an academic or a professional historian. I'm primarily a researcher. And the presentation I'm about to share grew out of my own curiosity, what some people might call a rabbit hole. And I can't really disagree. I've seen those rabbits myself. I'm so grateful also to the academic institutions and museums and archives, photographers and collectors who've allowed me to use the images in this presentation to hopefully make it a little bit more interesting and engaging for you. We're going to move pretty quickly through the slides, but if there are images, there are a lot of images, but and hopefully some you haven't seen before, but if there's an image you want to go back and see, or you think of the question, just keep those in mind, and we'll go back at the end and I'll address your questions at the end also. A period CDV, a handsome federal artilleryman, a member of Battery B of the 5th U.S. Artillery. He's standing next to a distinctive table there in front of that hand-painted backdrop. with this regulation artillery saber and his hat brass exhibited front and center there for us to see. It's a great image, but Battery B of the 5th U.S. wasn't at Fredericksburg. They weren't even organized until November of 1862 at Fort Hamilton, New York Harbor. So they didn't make it to Fredericksburg. We're here today to talk about the South Carolina Sergeant Richard Rowland Kirkland, the Angel of Marye's Heights. So you're probably wondering why I'm showing you this image of a federal soldier. But if you'll stick with me to the end, hopefully I'll connect the dots and you'll see how this image is related to the Kirkland story. Richard Rowland Kirkland, he's best known as the Angel of Marye's Heights, the Confederate soldier who risked his own life to provide aid to wounded Federals between the lines after the Battle of Fredericksburg. Kirkland served in the 2nd South Carolina, Kershaw's brigade, McLaws division, Longstreet's corps in the Army of Northern Virginia. He was killed at Chickamauga September 20th of 1863 during Kershaw's brigade's assault on Snodgrass Hill there. If you've been to the battlefield, you may have been there. He was 20 years old at that time, so he did not survive the war. So the Battle of Fredericksburg, most people probably know that's where the Kirkland incident took place. And it took place on the next day, the day after the main battle had occurred on the battle occurred on December 13th, but the Kirkland incident occurred the next day. And the Battle of Fredericksburg was between Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and Ambrose Burnside's. He was the brand new commander of the Army of the Potomac. And like I said, the Kirkland incident occurred the next day after the main part of the battle had concluded, after the Federal assaults had ended. So the purpose of this presentation is to investigate the Kirkland incident and how we remember it, not necessarily to detail the Battle of Fredericksburg, but a lot of the geography and position of regiments and things like that is important and helps in understanding the accounts. So I'll include some of that. So Richard Kirkland's act of kindness took place near his regiment's position on Sunday, December 14th, there in front of the Telegraph Road, near the Stevens House, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Kirkland's regiment, the 2nd South Carolina, was positioned in the sunken road there behind the stone wall at the base of Marye's Heights with other regiments of Kershaw's brigade and Cobb's. This is the view that Edwin Sumner's Grand Division would have had on December 13th. So the day that most of the federal assaults happened, what people mostly consider the main Battle of Fredericksburg. This is the view that they would have had. And just after the first Federal assault by French's division, General Cobb was mortally wounded there in the sunken road. And that was Thomas Reed Root's Cobb, not Hal Cobb. Both of these brigades, Cobb's and Kershaw's, were part of McLaws' division. And McLaws summoned Kershaw up and asked him to bring some reinforcements. At first, he brought 2 of his regiments, the 2nd South Carolina, Kirkland's regiment, and the 8th South Carolina. And he did that pretty quickly. But as they were moving up to the line, to the sunken road, Kershaw received a message from McLaws asking him to hurry ahead, that General Cobb had been wounded and he was needed to assume command. So some people like maps better than pictures. So for those folks who like maps, here's what that movement would have looked like from behind the Confederate lines, from the Confederate side. And like I said, at first only Kershaw's 2nd and 8th South Carolina came up, and those regiments went down into the road, as did Joseph Brevard Kershaw himself. But those regiments had to double up behind Cobb's regiments. The distance that they were covering didn't allow them to move in beside them at that point. So Kershaw ordered up the rest of his regiments, and they moved forward. The 16th Georgia of Cobb's brigade joined them up there, front line. And during the Federal assaults on Saturday, Kirkland's regiment, the 2nd South Carolina, was positioned there where you see them behind the stone wall in the sunken road with the 3 regiments of Cobb's and those regiments of North Carolinians, and those regiments were from Ransom and Cook's brigades. Anderson's division, Richard H. Anderson's division, was to their left, to the entire left of this screen, off further than what you can see here. So the low ridge known as Marye's Heights, it's about 600 yards west of the town of, main town of Fredericksburg. And it's only about 40 to 50 feet high above the ground in front, but it's still a fairly formidable position. And that little rise is called Marye's Heights because of this house that sits up on top of it. It was owned by John L. Marye. He was a Fredericksburg lawyer and businessman. And so the house there was called the Marye House, and the little hill was called Marye's Heights. At the base of the heights lay the Telegraph Road, known after the battle as the Sunken Road. You may have heard it called that. And this 4 to 4.5 foot stone wall protected the position. Confederate Major General Lafayette McLaws was commanding that division of infantry defending Marye's Heights, and he had those regiments of his brigade that we talked about earlier, Cobb's Georgians and Kershaw South Carolinians, positioned behind the stone wall. And some other Confederate regiments came and went. Those regiments of Kershaw's and Cobb's remained in that general area on the heights and in the Sunken Road through the day on December 13th and 14th. And massed artillery on Marye's Heights, positioned in behind them, provided fairly complete coverage of that entire plain below. From those heights above, Confederate Artillery Commander Lieutenant Colonel Edward Porter Alexander made a statement that has become pretty famous. "General, we cover that ground now so well that we could comb it as with a fine-tooth comb. A chicken could not live on that field when we open on it." And that's pretty much what happened. The last charge was driven back after dark on Saturday, December 13th, and the Federals ended their assaults, leaving the ground over which they had passed covered with the bodies of their dead, and of course wounded, who cried out for aid and water. So stop and think about that just a minute. That situation there for those Federals who had made the assault across that open ground. The further forward they made it, the closer they made it to the stone wall, the less likely they were to receive aid from their own side. So the litter bearers from their regiments and their brigade hospitals were less likely to be able to make it there to provide help to them. It had to be a pretty desperate situation, and hopelessness must have prevailed amid all the artillery and mini balls and of course the distance that played a factor too. So most people have probably heard of the story of the Angel of Marye's Heights, but just a quick summary for anybody who hasn't. 19-year-old Sergeant Richard Rowland Kirkland of the 2nd South Carolina, hearing the cries of the wounded overnight and the next morning, went to his Brigadier General Joseph Brevard Kershaw on the afternoon of Sunday, December 14th. And Kershaw had his headquarters at the Stevens House. And he said that he was in the north room overlooking the battlefield at the time that Kirkland came and asked permission to go across the line and provide water to the wounded Federals in front, the ones there nearest the wall. General Kershaw had been the original colonel of the 2nd South Carolina, and Kirkland and Kershaw both lived there in the same general vicinity. Kirkland in Flat Rock, and Kershaw lived there in Camden. So the men probably knew each other, had a closer relationship than what you would typically think of a brigadier general having with his a sergeant in one of his regiments. So this is an image from the South Caroliniana Library there in Columbia, South Carolina. And most people haven't seen this image before. It's in their collection there. Kershaw served as in the U.S. Army as a lieutenant of Company C of the Palmetto Regiment during the Mexican War. And so this image is either from the Mexican War era or perhaps an image from Kershaw's pre-war involvement with a militia service there called the Camden Light Infantry. But you can get an idea of what Kershaw would have looked like as a young colonel of the 2nd South Carolina, and then as a brigadier general in 1862. At first, when Kirkland came to ask permission, Kershaw tried to dissuade Kirkland, saying that he would surely be killed. There was still fairly heavy exchange of fire going on there between Sykes' division of regulars and the Confederate sharpshooters behind the wall. In fact, some accounts say that exchange was heavy and substantial enough to be considered incessant and fatal. Kirkland said that he just could no longer bear to hear the groans and anguish, and if General Kershaw would please just permit it, he would cross the line and relieve the suffering Federals. So Kershaw, once you've done some study of him, I've done quite a bit, and I'd characterize him as sensitive, caring, ethical. He took really good care of the troops under his command, and he was well respected by his peers, subordinates, and superiors. I'd classify him as magnanimous. And so Kirkland's appeal was too strong, and Kershaw relented. According to one important account, Kirkland expressed a premonition that he would not be killed. He gathered up canteens and crossed the wall, but his appearance initially drew fire. The Federals in view assumed that he was intent on rifling the dead, stealing souvenirs from the dead and wounded there in front of the wall. A volley of bullets, and yet he was unharmed. He went to the first wounded man and pressed a canteen to his lips, and the firing upon him slackened and eventually ceased, allowing him to move from one wounded Federal to another. And that's basically the short version of the story, but what a inspirational and iconic story it is. One that a lot of people have heard, and hopefully we can shed some light on how we interpret and remember the story today. Over the years, most historians have referred to this piece, The Nameless Confederate, as the first published report of the Kirkland incident. It doesn't specifically name Richard Rowland Kirkland as the hero, but it's clear that this reminiscence, written by the unnamed correspondent who uses the pseudonym C. McKay, and that this reminiscence implicates an enlisted member of one of Kershaw's regiments. This was published in the Charleston News and Courier, January 23rd, 1880. And it was actually an inquiry, right? C. McKay's asking, tell me more. Who was the guy who aided the Federals in front of the wall there? So almost immediately in response, General Kershaw wrote back to the Charleston News on January 29th, 1880, and he provides the name of the previously unnamed hero, as well as some additional particulars. And Kershaw's detailed description of Kirkland's act of kindness was reprinted in newspapers across the country. Today, we would say it went viral. And that narrative ultimately became the identity of Richard Rowland Kirkland. It's really how we know him today. But where did that nickname come from? The Angel of Marye's Heights. In 1908, this man, Walter Augustus Clark, wrote a poem, and his poem narrates Kirkland's compassionate act. Clark entitled his poem The Angel of Marye's Heights, and Clark is apparently the first person to ever apply that now well-known nickname. Clark was a veteran of the 1st and 63rd Georgia, but neither of those regiments were at Fredericksburg. In the January 1880 article, Kershaw calls Kirkland the previously unnamed hero, a ministering angel, and an example which dignifies our common humanity, but he does not call him the Angel of Marye's Heights. As I mentioned, Kershaw's account was published in newspapers all over the country, so it's possible that Clark's inspiration was one of those, that he saw one of those other articles and was inspired to write the poem. But until his poem was published in 1908, none of the other versions ever called Richard Kirkland the Angel of Marye's Heights. So it was Walter Clark's poem that resulted in the now common use of the well-known moniker, the Angel of Marye's Heights. Kirkland's mission of mercy has been memorialized in most every way imaginable. Watercolor sketches and illustrations like these, and more recently, most every modern artist who paints Civil War subjects has painted his own version of the Kirkland incident. Here's just a few of them. And this one, An Act of Compassion by Don Stivers. This one's my favorite. The soldier here, I think, looks the most like Richard Kirkland, or at least the pictures that we have of him. And I like the Confederate sharpshooters in the background peeking over the wall to watch him provide aid to the wounded Federal. Perhaps the most prominently displayed painting, though, is this one, exhibited at the South Carolina State House. This one is appropriately named The Angel of Marye's Heights, and it was unveiled April 17th, 1984, painted by Robert Winsor Wilson, an artist from Woodruff, South Carolina. And of course, there's lots of memorials. But the earliest mention, the first person to even suggest that Kirkland be memorialized, wasn't from South Carolina or Virginia or Fredericksburg or even anywhere in the South. In 1882, the Reverend Alvin Emil Tortot of Philadelphia and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, made that suggestion. At the time, Tortot was the president of the Soldiers Memorial Church Association, and they were attempting to organize the Prince of Peace church there at Gettysburg. That group was ultimately successful, and the church was established the next year. Such genuine heroism deserves a monument as high as the stars. The boys in blue will surely remember it. The next year, in 1901, a white marble stone was placed in the north tower of the Prince of Peace church. It's reported that some of the contributions were made by Federal survivors of the Battle of Fredericksburg. Lieutenant Richard Kirkland, Company E, 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, a hero of benevolence. At the risk of life, he gave his enemy drink at Fredericksburg. And that was the first memorial to commemorate Kirkland's errand of mercy. You'll recall that I said that Kirkland was killed at Chickamauga. He was originally buried on the battlefield. His remains were recovered. The family recovered his remains, brought them home to Flat Rock, and reinterred them there in the family cemetery in Flat Rock. In October of 1908, the John W. Kennedy chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy received permission from the family to move his remains from the family cemetery to Quaker Cemetery in Camden. They named the plot where they placed his remains Little Arlington. And today, Kirkland lies in the plot with local Medal of Honor recipient. In May of 1910, the UDC unveiled this memorial that you see on the screen. The speaker that day was the Reverend John Kershaw, and he was the son of Joseph Brevard Kershaw, who served alongside his father until both of them were captured at Sailor's Creek in April of 1865. Also in 1910, the city of Camden was gifted one of these National Humane Alliance Herman Lee Ensign fountains. They had to fill out a application to receive this. The granite fountains were produced in Vinyl Haven, Maine by the Bodwell Granite Company, and that's the same company that made the granite blocks for the Brooklyn Bridge. And this memorial fountain is made for humans and horses to drink from, but also if you notice at the bottom, you'll see these slots down here that were created for dogs to drink from. So clearly man and beast represented in this memorial. The same year, 1910, school children in Camden collected donations in their classrooms to fund this bronze plaque for the fountain, and it tells the story of Kirkland's compassionate act. And in 2001, this beautiful and moving memorial was unveiled in front of the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, entitled Moment of Mercy. It was sculpted by Terry Jones and dedicated in 2001. But my favorite, the emotional memorial statue on the battlefield at Fredericksburg in front of the Sunken Road, near the location where the incident happened 160 years ago. The funds were raised by the Richard Kirkland Memorial Association, headed up by Fredericksburg dentist and philanthropist, Dr. Richard Nunn Lanier. Lanier pursued the project tirelessly, recruiting the support of Kirkland's collateral descendants, soliciting contributions from the states of South Carolina and Virginia, seeking approval from Congress, and reviewing proposals from artists. And here in this image is from the Central Rappahannock Heritage Center. I appreciate them allowing me to use several images that you'll see. But this one shows Felix de Weldon, the artist that was eventually selected, there on the left, and Dr. Lanier on the right, and the model submission of the proposed memorial there between the two men. And in case you didn't recognize the name, Felix de Weldon is that same famous artist responsible for the U.S. Marine Corps Memorial, raising the flag on Mount Suribachi, commissioned in 1945, dedicated in 1954, and located in Arlington National Cemetery. After years of effort, Dr. Lanier was finally successful, and the Kirkland Memorial was dedicated September 29, 1965, almost 103 years after the humanitarian act occurred. This image, also from the Central Rappahannock Heritage Center, shows the dedication ceremony there in the Sunken Road, September 29th. And you see the artist there at the podium, Felix de Weldon, and the memorial statue there in the background. Unfortunately, Richard Nunn Lanier was not able to be present that day. He did not live to see his dream accomplished. Lanier died April 13th, 1964, 16 months before the memorial was dedicated. Then in December 2009, a historian named Michael Schaffner published a guest blog on Kevin Levine's blog site. The blog site's called Civil War Memory. And the name of Schaffner's entry was, "Is the Richard Kirkland Story True?" Questioning the validity overall of the Kirkland story and also the identity of the hero. Like most people, I guess, I never really thought there was a question of whether it happened, or certainly not whether or not Richard Kirkland was the hero. But I'm primarily a researcher, and so just because something's well known doesn't necessarily mean it's true. In that blog, Schaffner cites several factors that led to his opinion that the Kirkland story, as told by Joseph Brevard Kershaw, in his opinion, is a fictionalized exaggeration or a generalization. And first of all, he cites the time elapse between the act and its reporting. So 1862, when it happened, to 1880, when Kershaw's account was first published, that is 18 years, and that is a fairly long time. Schaffner also mentions lack of timely primary source corroboration, absence of mention in the official records, and Kershaw's use of flowery language as additional factors that led him to conclude that it was fictionalized, that it either never happened or that it wasn't Kirkland. Soon afterwards, in 2010, early in 2010, National Park Service historian Mac Wyckoff responded, and Mr. Wyckoff provided a couple of earlier primary sources that he felt confirmed or at least supported Kershaw's version. A memorandum by volunteer Union nurse Walt Whitman dated January 21st, 1863, and the unpublished memoirs of Colonel James R. Hagood of the 1st South Carolina. Both of these accounts preceded Kershaw's 1880 published report, but neither of these sources names Richard Kirkland. It's clear that both of these accounts describe a Confederate soldier who crosses the line to provide aid to wounded Federals. Walt Whitman's account, that was recorded January 21st, 1863, just a few weeks after the event occurred. Whitman, of course, served as a volunteer nurse at the Lacey House, Chatham, crossed the Rappahannock from where the incident occurred. But Whitman didn't arrive at Fredericksburg until Friday, December 19th. And Kirkland's Mission of Mercy, you'll recall, I said happened on December 14th. So Whitman could not have been an eyewitness. It doesn't necessarily mean that his report lacks credibility, just that Whitman himself wasn't an eyewitness to the event. Whitman is reporting on an interview with one of his patients who relays the details of Kirkland's benevolence, or not necessarily Kirkland, but a Confederate soldier's benevolence there on the field. Most likely one of the Federal soldiers who was a recipient of Kirkland's aid. The other account from James R. Hagood, during the Battle of Fredericksburg, Hagood's 1st South Carolina was part of Micah Jenkins' brigade. Unfortunately, that they were in Pickett's division. Unfortunately, there are no reports from anyone in Pickett's division, including Micah Jenkins. There's no official report, or if he filed one, it was lost. In order to witness Kirkland's benevolent act on Sunday, December 14th, Hagood would have needed to be in a position where he could see down there onto the field. And I wanted to really know what that view would have looked like. So this is a detail from a recently discovered image from the University of Maryland at Baltimore Civil War collection. And to help you understand just how open it was at the time. The image dates to March of 1863, just a few months after the Battle of Fredericksburg. So this would have been the view on December 13th, the day that most of the Union assaults happened. And then, of course, on the following day, December 14th, when the Humanitarian Act took place. Our informant, James R. Hagood, was there acting as the adjutant of the 1st South Carolina at the time. So in order to see, he would have needed to be in this area behind Kershaw on Marye's Heights or somewhere else where he had a view down into the sunken road and onto the field there near the Stevens house where Kirkland's Mission of Mercy originated. There, of course, is a sunken road, and the pink circle defines pretty much the area that he would have needed to be able to see. So here we are again behind those Confederate lines with the map, and you can see again that the green line here is the sunken road. The yellow line represents the edge of Marye's Heights. The little platform is kind of a visual to help you understand that was Marye's Height, that was higher than the surrounding ground. And so Hagood would have needed to be in this area where he would have had a view. This green little revolving dot here, let's see if I can make there you go. The little green square there is representative of the Stevens house where Kershaw's headquarters was. So the 1st South Carolina was part of Jenkins' brigade, I said. And like I mentioned, there's no report from Micah Jenkins to tell us where the regiments of his brigade were positioned or how they were located or the timing of any of that. But Colonel Edward D. Hall mentions Jenkins' brigade in his report. And after Brigadier General John Rogers Cook was wounded on December 13th, Colonel Hall assumed command of Cook's brigade here. And so it was Hall who wrote the report for Cook's brigade. And Colonel Hall says that Jenkins' brigade relieved Cook's North Carolinians on Sunday morning, December 14th. And Jenkins' brigade included the 1st South Carolina. And Kemper, who came up here, had already sent his 1st and 7th Virginia down into the sunken road to relieve the 24th North Carolina. And he had done that overnight on the 13th. So theoretically, Kemper moves his 3 regiments here behind the 1st and 7th Virginia up onto the heights and gives room for Jenkins to come up onto the height with his regiments. And that would put James R. Hagood's regiment here, the 1st South Carolina, approximately. And here's that theoretical position of the 1st South Carolina transferred onto this image, this drawing, so that you can kind of see where they would have been on the ground there. And here's that detailed enlargement again from the University of Maryland's, that image at the University of Maryland, and the approximate position superimposed onto the photograph. And finally, a super enlarged detail. I blew it all the way up so that you could see where that was and what it looked like and what the visibility. You can see that the visibility from anywhere along here would have been expansive down into the field, into the area of the Stevens house where the incident would have presumably, the Mission of Mercy would have originated. If you've been there, you've seen it's much more developed now. And so you can't see, it doesn't look like this today. So if Colonel Hall was correct, if Colonel Hall was accurate, then you can see that the 1st South Carolina's position, or really any of Jenkins' brigades, regiments, would have had a view down into the road and into the area of the Stevens house. And you can visit Fredericksburg today and see all these places yourself. That's the purpose of this map here, is to encourage you to do that. So Jenkins, or all these positions, but where I said that Walt Whitman was a nurse here at the Lacey House, that's National Park Service property. All this area of the Sunken Road is National Park Service, not all of it, but the Sunken Road itself is National Park Service property. And you can see those positions of those theoretical positions I showed you, the 2nd South Carolina and the position of James Hagood's 1st South Carolina based on Hall's report. So back to Whitman and Hagood, though, we can conclude that Union volunteer nurse Walt Whitman wasn't an eyewitness, and that James R. Hagood easily could have been, perhaps likely was. So you'll recall those historians, Schaffner, who alleged that Kirkland's act of kindness was fabrication or exaggeration or fictionalized, and National Park historian Mac Wyckoff, who pointed to the Whitman and Hagood accounts as rebuttal. What neither of them knew at the time, if Wyckoff or Schaffner knew about this, then they didn't cite it or utilize it in the debate, so it would seem that they did not know about it at the time. That there was this much earlier published account, January 18th of 1874, 6 years before Kershaw's version appeared in the Charleston News and Courier. This account from the Louisville Ledger, reprinted in the Daily Phoenix and narrated by a man who was in Kershaw's brigade. And it names Richard Rowland Kirkland as the hero. I'm just going to read an excerpt for you so you don't try to read the screen. A correspondent of the Louisville Ledger thus speaks of a picture which is being executed by Captain W.P. Hicks of this city, and it says of this city because it's being reprinted in Columbia. This is sort of a little preface to the article. The figures will be life-size. The sudden death of Mr. Wern will not deter Captain Hicks, one of the finest and most famous portrait and landscape painters in the South, from carrying out his announced determination to undertake the execution of a great national work based on a heroic incident which took place at the fierce Battle of Fredericksburg. The incident is this: after the gallant charge of the National Irish Brigade upon the stone fence, which a portion of General Kershaw's division of South Carolinians were posted, the ground was covered with the dead and dying, and when they retreated, both armies kept up a murderous sharpshooting upon each other. Sergeant Kirkland, one of the sharpshooters stationed behind the stone wall, is the hero of the incident. He belonged to the 2nd South Carolina Infantry. And this Captain Hicks goes on to tell basically the same story that Kershaw told 6 years later. Obviously, the article is significant. Kershaw couldn't have fabricated the story in 1880 that was told by someone else 6 years earlier. And this one and Kershaw's 1880 report both name Kirkland as the man who performed the benevolent act. But who is this Captain W.P. Hicks? Once I found that 1874 account, the focus of my research shifted a bit to figure out who this Hicks was, if he was a real person and if he would have a way to know about the incident. And he is a real person. His name is William Preston Hicks. He was a portrait artist, the son of carriage maker Edward Hicks, and he lived in Lawrence, South Carolina. Preston Hicks and his three brothers all enlisted in Captain B.C. Garlington's company, which became Company A of the 3rd South Carolina. And the 3rd South Carolina was part of Kershaw's brigade, and they were there with Kershaw's brigade at Fredericksburg. Our informant, William Preston Hicks, was discharged February 13th, 1862, on a surgeon's certificate of disability. So he wouldn't have likely been at Fredericksburg in December of 1862, but his brothers were. After his discharge for disability, he served in the Confederate Treasury Department in Richmond. It was there that he met Caroline Stallmaker, and they were both employed as signers of Confederate Treasury notes. The couple was married in Richmond in 1863, and Caroline Stallmaker changed her name to Hicks, making her the only signer of Confederate currency to sign using two different names. During his time in the Confederate Treasury Department, Hicks also served as a first lieutenant in the 3rd Battalion, Virginia Infantry for Local Defense. That was composed of clerks in the various government departments there in Richmond. And they served in George Washington Custis Lee's brigade. So this Hicks, he was never a captain. His highest rank was lieutenant. And the rank captain that was used there in the 1874 article is likely an honorary one due to his involvement in the United Confederate Veterans. But this Hicks, so far as is known, is the first person to relate an account of Sergeant Kirkland's compassionate act and to name him. Again, our informant Hicks wouldn't have been there at Fredericksburg, but his older brother, Edward Melville Hicks, was at Fredericksburg with the 3rd South Carolina of Kershaw's brigade. He served as a corporal, sergeant major, and straight through Fredericksburg and on into Knoxville, where he was wounded in front of the Bleak House, November 18th of 1863. He was in prison. He was captured in the hospital there and imprisoned and wasn't released until September of 1864, but he was there at Fredericksburg. Hicks's younger brothers, Willis Dickey and Clarence Eugene Hicks, they both served in Company A of the 3rd South Carolina also. Both of them were at Fredericksburg too. We know they were there because Eugene was killed on December 13th, and it was our informant, William Preston Hicks, who filed for his back pay on their father's behalf. Willis Dickey Hicks was wounded in the foot on December 13th at Fredericksburg. The position of the 3rd South Carolina there was up on Marye's Heights. It was an especially treacherous position, and the casualties were very high. Mike Wyckoff calls the position there northeast of the Marye's house, where the 3rd South Carolina was originally positioned. He calls it the killing knoll, and rightly so. 6 or 7 commanding officers in the 3rd South Carolina were killed and wounded within a few minutes there. The regiment lost 41%, and some company losses were as high as 89%. Hicks's brother, Willis Dickey, was one of those casualties. Wounded in the foot, he returned to the regiment in May of 1863, survived Gettysburg, and served through the rest of the war. He was present for the surrender at Greensboro. So while our informant, William Preston Hicks, wasn't likely a witness to the Kirkland incident, his brother Edward, the older brother, was, and he survived the war. I said this Hicks was an artist, and it turns out he led a pretty interesting life. The newspaper article, that 1874 article, said that he was going to create a mural or a large painting with life-size images to memorialize Kirkland's humanitarian act. But he was a portrait artist, and he worked in photography, colorized tintypes, and he painted portraits. Prior to and after the war, he was in partnership with a man named Richard Wern there in Columbia, and their gallery was called the Wern and Hicks Photo Emporium there on Richardson Street. And they were partners in photography for 15 years, all except for the time when Hicks was serving in the 3rd South Carolina and the Treasury Department. Richard Wern, Hicks's partner, is probably best known for a series of 1865. It's a series of 19 images that depict the destruction of Columbia. And ironically, this one at the lower right is of the Confederate Treasury Note Bureau there in Columbia. The Bureau moved from Richmond to Columbia in April of 1864. So it's possible that Hicks and his wife might have gone in that building for purposes of their Treasury Department employment. And the Warren and Hicks partnership is probably best known for this 1868 image of Robert Smalls. And yes, that's the Robert Smalls, the man who stole the Confederate steamer Planter and sailed her and her crew to freedom there in the Charleston Harbor. He was a post-war U.S. congressman for South Carolina. Warren and Hicks took all kinds of photographs. I just selected a few military ones as examples from a variety of sources, including collector Robert Buff of Columbia. I appreciate Mr. Buff allowing me to use a bunch of his images, including this beautiful hand-colored CDV of an unidentified Confederate lieutenant colonel. The images backmarked Warren and Hicks, and the hand coloring was probably the work of our informant, William Preston Hicks. That was his specialty in the photography business. And so besides photography, I said this Hicks was an artist, and here's one of his works that was up until recently very unknown. In October of 1866, the Yorkville Inquirer reported a painting that William Preston Hicks was working on, and they had the name of the painting there in the newspaper article, "Women of the South Decorating the Graves of the Confederate Dead." A few months later, the Confederate Monthly reported completion of the painting. No one knows where the painting is today. If you happen to have it in your house, please let us know. Raise your hand and show it to us. We'd be glad to see it. This is a CDV of the painting there from the collection of the South Carolina Library. They had the CDV, and I appreciate them allowing me to use it. They knew it was a CDV of a painting, but they had no idea who the artist was. And I found it based on keywords in the content, the composition, and was able to match the description of Hicks's painting from the newspaper articles to this one, sent them all the documentation, and now the image is identified at the library there as you see it here on the screen. It's kind of reminiscent of William D. Washington's 1864, famous 1864 painting, similar composition. You see the black man leaning on the shovel, the family at graveside mourning. But in the background of this one, you can see off to the side here, these 4 columns. And the folks at the South Carolina Library tell me that these are reminiscent of the remains of the Millwood plantation after it was destroyed. And it's located there outside of Columbia. So the image is backmarked Warren and Hicks. So the CDV of the painting was made by the Warren and Hicks Photo Emporium. So you may be looking at this painting and thinking that it's kind of primitive. I don't really feel like this one's indicative of his talent. Here's one you might not have seen before, or if you did, you had no way to know that it was who the artist was or that it was connected to the Kirkland story. William Preston Hicks eventually developed into a very talented artist, and he painted this fantastic 1873 portrait of Joseph Brevard Kershaw in the collection of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. It measures 42 by 55 inches, a life-size rendering like the one that he was planning to paint to commemorate Kirkland's heroic act. He also painted other portraits. Here's one, John Preston, in the collection of the House Gallery portraits at the South Carolina State House. I won't mention the others, but there are quite a few. The Warren and Hicks partnership ended suddenly in 1874, January of 1874, when Richard Warren took his own life. Following Warren's death, Hicks bought the other half of the interest and in the business and continued to operate on his own, giving much attention to the tinting of photographs and producing paintings in oil and watercolor. Preston Hicks went on to achieve success as a businessman, including at least 6 years with this man you might recognize, Thomas Alva Edison. Hicks moved to New York in 1893 to work more closely with Edison, and he bought this beautiful house and 56 acres on Rye Beach Avenue in the township of Rye, and enjoyed that home for 18 years until he died there in the garden in 1911. His wife and daughter Rose lived on in the house after his death until June of 1920, when inability to pay taxes and expenses of upkeep forced this auction sale. Preston Hicks was buried in Westchester County, New York. And I know I just said he died in 1911, so you're looking at this grave marker and thinking that I might have misspoken. But unless the New York Times published his obituary a year early, he really did die in 1911. And again, these exaggerated ranks, captain in the 1874 article and colonel in this one, his highest rank was that first lieutenant when he was in the 3rd Battalion, Virginia Infantry for local defense. But this colonel is just an honorary title used for related to his UCV membership. I thought it was interesting that there was a UCV chapter, a UCV camp right there in New York City that Hicks was active in. And it was actually the members of that camp who made sure that his obituary was published. Our informant, William Preston Hicks, led a fascinating and sometimes challenging life, but it's possible that his most important contribution is not related to his paintings or his photography or his portraits or his success in business or his association with Thomas Alva Edison or any of those things, really. Hicks's account is the first source to name Richard Rowland Kirkland as the hero between the lines after the Battle of Fredericksburg. It predates Joseph Brevard Kershaw's account by 6 years and names Kirkland as the man who performed the benevolent act, pretty much eliminating the notion that Kershaw fabricated the story. Hicks had 2 brothers who survived the war, and at least one of them witnessed the incident. Besides his 2 brothers who survived the war, Hicks was associated with veterans of Kershaw's brigade in Columbia, South Carolina, as part of his UCV activities. We can surmise that men who could have, should have, and would have known about the event and who performed it believed that it happened as Hicks described, and that it was Richard Rowland Kirkland who was the hero. It was accepted as fact by members, veterans of Kershaw's brigade. Certainly, William Preston Hicks's 1874 narrative lends credibility to James R. Hagood's memoirs and the Joseph Kershaw 1880 account. In my opinion, Hicks's account confirms that Richard Rowland Kirkland really was the hero we've always known him to be. It provides all the confirmation I need to believe that Richard Kirkland deserves the moniker the Angel of Marye's Heights, and that this memorial appropriately commemorates his selfless act at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. So at the beginning of the presentation, I promised to try to connect the dots so that you could see how this hand-colored CDV of an unidentified federal artilleryman from Battery B of the 5th U.S. is related to the Kirkland story. And I told you that Battery B wasn't at Fredericksburg, but after the war, they were ordered to Columbia, South Carolina, as part of the occupation force. The image is backmarked Wern and Hicks, and the backmark matches the one used by Wern and Hicks during the occupation period. So while he was in Columbia, our handsome unidentified federal artilleryman had his likeness made at the Wern and Hicks Photo Emporium, and our informant, William Preston Hicks, colorized this image. Thank you all so much for attending today and for your interest and attention. I appreciate the opportunity again to share the research, the presentation, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to address them now.
Laura, can you hear me?
Thanks, Laura. That was great. Thanks, Laura. That was great. So much fascinating research. Unbelievable. I know we've got some questions that are lined up, and if you're ready to take those, we can start now. Are you ready? Okay, first up, we have Mr. Hal Litchford.
Okay,
Yeah, Laura, great stuff. It's really informative.
thank you so much.
The question I have is that original paintings. It sounds wonderful. It sounds like it ought to be around somewhere. The one that commemorates Kirkland's act. Where is it now? Do you know?
Ah, what a great question. The painting, the one that Hicks talked about, his intent to paint a large mural or life-size painting to commemorate Kirkland's benevolent act. He painted, I showed you the one at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, the fantastic portrait of Joseph Kershaw. I showed you the John Preston painting and Women of the South, the CDV of that painting, Women of the South, decorating the graves. He also painted post-war portraits of Matthew Cal Butler, Loring, and Beauregard. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to locate any of those paintings. And the one to commemorate Kirkland's benevolence, what we know is that we don't know if he ever finished it, if he ever even started it. We know that in 1874, he said he had an intent to paint a life-size painting or mural to commemorate Kirkland's benevolent act. Perhaps it was never finished and it was rolled up and put in somebody's attic or stored in the wall at the photo emporium and it was never completed. Or, perhaps it was finished and it was exhibited in a store or the bank there in Columbia and they have it rolled up in their attic and don't even know. But if you happen to have it in your attic, let us know.
Thanks.
Thanks. Do you have it in your attic? Thanks, Hal. Great question.
Okay, and next we have Mr. Charles Derby, who has a question for you, Laura.
Okay, great. Hey,
Hey,
Mr.
Laura, I love your story of Preston Hicks. He was a South Carolinian living in South Carolina when his account was published, but it was
Yes.
published in Louisville, Kentucky, the ledger there. Why?
Great question. Yes, it was originally published in the Louisville Ledger. Let me see. I'm going to show you something. Let me see if I can share my screen again for you so that you can see. He did actually the account, the first written report of the Kirkland incident, which was narrated by William Preston Hicks, was published in the Louisville Ledger. And here is why. Hicks and his friend George Darling had gone to Louisville to collect their winnings. They had won the lottery there. And I'm assuming that William Preston Hicks split that with his friend George Darling, but this appeared in the Daily Phoenix. This little snippet appeared in the Daily Phoenix in April. And of course, the account appeared in January of 1874. So we can assume that during the time that Hicks was there to collect the money, right, from the lottery, that he gave this report to the Louisville Ledger there. And the money would have come at a great time for him because his partner had just died. Richard Wern had just taken his life, and so the winning of the lottery could not have come at a better time for Hicks than it did right there. So great question. Thank you so much.
All right, Laura, I've got a question for you here.
Hi, Rick.
Were there any other accounts of Kirkland's humanitarian acts, ones that you didn't talk about in your speech here?
Oh yeah,
Reports?
there's a lot of them. I mean, it's been talked about a lot, and there's been a lot of accounts. One of the things that I really tried to do in my research was to focus on accounts that preceded Joseph Kershaw's 1880 version. Once that newspaper article appeared and started being reprinted all over the country, it's hard to really tell when somebody was remembering something they saw themselves or if they were just repeating a story they had read in the newspaper. So I really tried to focus on those accounts that preceded Kershaw's version in 1880. But I believe that one of the accounts that you might be asking about is actually from one of your ancestors, Malachi Reeves of the 1st Texas Hood's Brigade. And you saw those images of the ground there. So it's certainly possible that a member of Hood's Brigade could have seen onto the field, now that you can see those images and see how open it is. And Malachi Reeves wrote about the Kirkland incident as part of his memoirs that he gave to his daughter. Is that right?
His daughter.
And he gave those memoirs or reminiscences to her in 1910 or 20.
Yeah, somewhere in 1910.
Yeah. So they were undated, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not that they're not reliable or that he didn't witness it. It just means that my research really focused on accounts that happened before Kershaw's was published. It's entirely possible that Malachi Reeves was a direct witness. I imagine that McLaw's division would have been talked about in McLaw's division as an occurrence that day, and also with veterans, who were members of the United Confederate Veterans would have talked about it at their meetings and things like that. There was another interesting account though that you asked for. There were ones I didn't talk about, and in this one, Mac Wyckoff actually found an account in a Bamberg Herald. It's a South Carolina newspaper. And it was by a man named Hunter. And this Hunter was a member of the Rents. He talks about a man named Isaac Rents. And Isaac Rents was a member of the 2nd South Carolina. And Hunter basically is telling the story of the Kirkland incident. And then, he talks about Kirkland going out to aid. And then he says that Rents, this man named Isaac Rents, was his friend, and he saw him go out there and provide field canteens for Kirkland and carry these canteens and give them to Kirkland. And that here's a quote: "Just then, Isaac Rents, seeing it, filled several canteens and carried water to Kirkland, and they gave water to every crying man and was not hurt." He means they weren't hurt. They weren't shot while they were doing it. And interestingly, this Hunter who wrote the account is in the 1st South Carolina Hagood's regiment. So the same regiment as the informant James R. Hagood. Here's another account from a man in his regiment. Of course, that was Jenkins' brigade, and I showed you on the map that theoretical position of where Jenkins' brigade would have been, and those images, so that you can see how open that ground was. So it's interesting that this man provides an account from the same regiment that James Hagood was in, and it closely matches Hagood's account, except for the fact that he adds the information about Rents's role in the situation. So your ancestors' memoirs are very valuable, and of course we are.
I'm sure there's probably other soldiers that eyewitnessed this that have personal letters. That there's probably a lot of personal letters that they saw this that are out there somewhere that we need to find if we can.
Yeah, that'd be great. Unfortunately, sometimes families they'll get a pile of letters and they're not valuable to them, so they'll destroy them or throw them away, or
Terrible.
Yeah, terrible. So hopefully, we can get the word out there that people should donate those to local history museum or archives or somewhere where we can access them, or at least scan them.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thanks
Laura.
so much, Rick, and thanks so much for Malachi Reeves recording the incident that he
You
did.
bet, you bet.
Laura,
Yes.
we're gonna let Philip had a question. We're gonna let him go out of turn because he's got a conflict, but he really had a question that
Okay, yeah, go
we're gonna
ahead.
jump around a little
Yeah.
bit. Sorry.
Go ahead, Philip.
It's my wife's birthday and she'll be home in about 45 minutes. So I
Oh
got
my goodness, tell her I said
There
happy
you go.
birthday.
But listening to this was great. A lot of information, a lot of sources, and Rick's
Thanks.
question there. You covered a lot there. And in all of those, what do you say was the one that was most helpful to you in this research?
Oh my gosh. There were so many. Let me well, there's actually two that pop in my head immediately, and maybe they're not the most helpful to anybody else, or maybe it's just that I liked them the best. Can I just give you that as the answer? So first off, there was a very detailed report of Kershaw's brigade, the role of Kershaw's brigade in the Battle of Fredericksburg. And you've probably, being a Gettysburg National Military Park licensed battlefield guide, I'm sure you've run across some of those reports from Kershaw, who reported back to the Charleston Courier, and he provided those really detailed reports.
Yeah.
So it was one of those from Kershaw, reprinted or published January 13th, 1863. And that, of course, was Felix Gregory de Fontaine, and I'm sure you've seen his reports for lots of other battles and for Gettysburg. But he seems like he had access to insider information, on Kershaw's brigade. I mean, he was with them from the beginning, early on in the war, and he even reported on their activities at Chickamauga. So I have a lot of confidence in his reports. And then the second one didn't have nearly as much detailed information, but I just loved it. It was a reminiscence of a memoir by a guy named J.R. who was in the 3rd South Carolina. And of course, that was Hicks's and his brother's regiment. And it was published in 1906. And it includes the story of the Georgian who refused to be killed. And it has got to be one of the best stories of the entire Civil War. I'll just give you a synopsis. So the Georgian was evidently in one of those regiments of Cobb's brigade that was behind the stone wall. He gets shot in the arm. He goes up onto Marye's Heights to get to the field infirmary, which was on the other side of the hill. And while he's up there, he runs into two members of the 3rd South Carolina, and they sit down behind the stone wall, and then they make their way over. There's a mill pond there, and they make their way over, and they're sitting against the mill pond. So they tell the Georgian to sit between them because, he was loudly complaining, "Oh, I'm going to die. Y'all have to bury me. If I die, I don't want the buzzards to eat me." And so these South Carolinians, they tell him to stop being a baby, basically, and suck it up and stop being a baby. You're going to be fine. But yes, if you die, we'll bury you. So then they decide to get up and make a run for it. And there's shells coming over, and they're watching them land on the mill pond's frozen, and they're hitting the ice and bouncing. So the shell bounces up, and so they make a run for it, and the shell hits, they sit it down over there, and a shell comes across and hits the guy in the chest. The wounded Georgian, right arm shot. Now he's hit in the chest with a cannonball that bounced up off the ice. And so they think he's dead. So they try to give him some water, and suddenly he revives, and he starts coughing up blood, but he rallies, they say he rallies. And so then they have to get up and try to run again. Well, he's able to get up and go with them this time. But another cannonball bounced across and hits him in the back and sends him cartwheeling across the ground. So they think he's dead this time for sure. And so they go on to the field infirmary, send a litter bearer back and to go find him, tell him where to go. And the guy goes back and gets him. And when they went to Richmond, he went with them. And in a few days, he was able to be up and around. Isn't that a great story?
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
Yeah. So one tough Georgian, shot
Yeah,
in the arm, cannonball in the back, cannonball in the front.
Wow.
He got it all the way around. Anyway, I like both of those a lot. So thanks for asking. I'm not sure either one of them is really the most helpful for the research, but I like both of them a lot.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Philip.
And Mr. Sessoms has 2 questions for you, if you don't
Okay,
mind.
sure. Hi, Mr. Sessoms. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so great presentation, and
Thank you so much.
kind of got me thinking about some of the things that you were saying, and especially when those illustrations came up. Each of the illustrations showed a different Union soldier laying on the ground.
Mhm.
So it kind of made me wonder, how many Union soldiers did Kirkland actually help? And of those he helped, do we know, were there any survivors?
That's a great question. And we, I believe that Union volunteer nurse Walt Whitman's report is actually evidence of at least one of those soldiers who survived, because it tells us it's dated after Whitman actually arrived. Remember, I said Whitman arrived on December the 18th. And the incident happened on December 14th of 1862. So Whitman wasn't there. So the only way he would have known about a Confederate soldier coming onto the field and providing aid would be if someone there in the hospital told him about it. So I think that that's evidence of at least one who survived long enough to get back to the hospital, to the field hospital. But you asked how many total Union Federals was Kirkland able to help, and we don't really know that, because there's no way to know. They were so isolated from their own line, it's hard to know if they were reported as killed or wounded. Even their own regiment wouldn't have known if they were still alive out there. So it's hard to know, but what we do know is that Joseph Kershaw tells us that Kirkland came to his headquarters in the afternoon there in the Stevens house and asked permission to go and provide aid. And when he did that, Kershaw says it was afternoon. So we also know that sundown happened at 4:53 that day. That was sunset. So there wasn't a lot of time in the afternoon for it to happen. Kershaw tells us that Kirkland was on the field for an hour and a half providing aid. And we know that he went from one federal soldier to another to provide aid for an hour and a half. Whether it got dark and that put an end to his humanitarian aid, or whether something else happened to where he had to come back, we don't know. But an hour and a half, and however many men he was able to help in that amount of time.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. Great question too. Thanks for asking it.
Okay. The last question that we have, Mr. Dassinger had asked a question, but I see that, oh, there he is. He's back. We're going to let him ask it himself. So,
Okay.
and we're going to spotlight him and let him ask his question.
All right.
Thanks, Laura. Great research. And as an enthusiast of Kershaw, with the flowery report that he gave, so and then that being a reason that some folks discounted what he had said. Do you think? Did you find, as an enthusiast of Kershaw, have you found that consistent with the way that he wrote reports, or the way that he gave accounts of different things, and does that kind of make his report seem more valid because of what you're finding, or did you find out that that's not normally what he does, and maybe there's some validation to it not being truthful?
Great question. Thanks. Something I haven't really thought a lot about, but I think what I would say is that when Kershaw wrote an official report, like an after action report, it was more straight to the point, because it was a military document. And so Kershaw's military reports are extremely accurate. And if he says it's 600 yards from the edge of the woods to the cemetery wall, then when you go there and you walk it, it's going to be 600 yards from if the edge of the woods are still in the same place and the cemetery wall hasn't moved, it's going to be 600 yards. So his reports are very reliable and accurate. But what I will say is his use of the English language is so different from what we think of today, and of course would be considered flowery now compared to, you know, how people talked back then. I think the way he uses the language would be classified as flowery today, but it's how he communicated in public, not necessarily in his military records and official reports, but in public. He was from an upper class family, you know, planters. Both of his grandfathers were patriots of the American Revolution, and it's just how people of his class talked back then. So I would say that anyone who calls into question his report of the Kirkland incident based on flowery language, maybe they haven't read a lot of what else he wrote that wasn't, you know, things other than military reports. And this is my favorite. I'm going to give you my favorite example because I just sent it to somebody today. From a speech given on his retirement. Joseph Brevard Kershaw was retiring from the Camden Light Infantry, retiring from command. It was a pre-war militia company that he was captain of there in Camden. And this is what he said: "In this sincere effort on my part, at times, some word of irritation or too rigid exaction of some disagreeable duty may have grated harshly upon the feelings of some one of you. Let it be buried in by the Lethean waters of oblivion, which flow from a sense of human infirmity. It was never meant. For myself, gentlemen, I am proud to declare that no single reminiscence of a painful or unpleasant nature has impressed itself upon my mind in the whole course of our association." That was from a speech. So that is how he spoke in public. And many of his communications back with the newspaper, you know, maybe not quite that flowery, but yes, that's how he communicated in public. And it was a little bit different from how he wrote his official report. So that's a great question. Thanks for making me think about it. And thanks for asking the question.
A complex thinker, isn't he?
Absolutely. Isn't that the truth? Very. And, you know, one of the things when you say that, some things he was very complex thinker on, and other things he was just straight to the point. So this it reminded me, this picture behind me, while Dennis and I were working on this research, I found this account that talked like he had gone straight down the hill, right? When he got up there on Marye's Heights, as he brought the 2nd and 8th South Carolina, that he didn't go around to come down on the nice sloping road, that he just jumped, you know, he just went straight down the hill. And sure enough, we started looking for additional sources, and that's exactly. So in that instance, the quickest way possible, straight down the hill, even though he's shot in the arm there and his horse is shot while he's going down the hill. But it was the quickest way to get into the road to assume command because Cobb had been mortally wounded. And he needed to be down there in the road as fast as possible. But in other times, that very complex way that he went about explaining that he hoped they didn't have any grudges against him, that's basically what he was saying as he retires. I hope you don't have any grudges against me. I've enjoyed this, and I don't have any bad feelings. If I ever offended you, I'm sorry. That's what he meant to say in all those 250 words or whatever it was. But on the other hand, he instead of going around here, he went straight down that hill and wound up getting shot in the arm and everything else. So I don't know, a very complex individual to understand.
What was the name of his horse?
Stone, Old Stone. His name, the horse was captured at Manassas. And I'm actually writing an article for you about that. I don't know if I've told you yet, but for Blue and Gray Education Society's newsletter, I'm going to write that story up for you because it's a fantastic, the story of the horse, great story. Thanks for asking.
Very good.
Great question. Thanks so much. Any more questions?
Okay. I think that's all the questions that we have. Mr. Johnson has been standing by, and I asked him if he wanted to close us out or sing a song or something, but I think he's declined. So,
No, I'm here. Can y'all
okay,
hear me?
yeah.
Yeah, Laura, that was a great presentation, but it made me wonder, were there any other Confederate soldiers that went out on the field to help Kirkland provide aid?
Oh, great question. Yeah. That account that I told you about that Mac Wyckoff located about Isaac Rentz,
Right.
where his friend, after Rentz had passed, his friend writes to the newspaper and says that he assisted Kirkland. And so what in that article, what he says is just then Isaac Rentz, seeing it, filled several canteens and carried water to Kirkland. And they gave water to every crying man and was not hurt. But what I found, another possibility, is that perhaps Isaac Rentz did carry canteens to Kirkland and hand them to him. But I found, let me share my screen and show you this. Let's see if I can find it. Not Isaac. There's the story about Isaac Rentz. It's a great story. So J. William Jones, he was the he wrote Christ in the Camp. He organized the Chaplains Association of the Army in Northern Virginia. He was very involved after the war, post-war. He was a Baptist minister there in Lexington, Virginia. And he's the man who edited and compiled Robert E. Lee's letters and published that. It's called Personal Reminiscence, Anecdotes, and Letters of General Robert E. Lee, and it was published in 1874. So J. William Jones had a lot of connections, and so evidently somebody wrote to him or was writing about the incident and said, why did nobody else go and help, or did anybody else go and help? And so what Jones tells us is that he gives the whole story, right? He tells us the whole story of Kirkland's humanitarian aid, but then he says that his comrades gladly filling canteens for him and being prevented from joining him in his labor of love only by the orders against the crossing of the line. And so you can remember that I said that Kirkland actually went to Kershaw's headquarters and requested permission to cross the line. And so I assume that what Jones is saying here is that nobody else was allowed to cross the line because they didn't go and ask permission. And even if they had, I doubt, their commanders would have given it to them. Kershaw, I kind of alluded to it a little bit. Kershaw and Kirkland's, they would have known each other more than what you would think of a normal brigadier general knowing one of the sergeants in one of his regiments, because both of them had served in the 2nd South Carolina since the commencement of the war. So, when it was just the 2nd South Carolina, Kershaw was the commander. Kirkland was a private at that point, or maybe a sergeant before Kershaw was promoted. But anyway, so they had been together in that 2nd South Carolina since the commencement of the war. So I think that, in that case, Kirkland had a little bit of an insider edge to go and talk to Kershaw. A normal sergeant in a normal regiment in a brigade maybe wouldn't have even gotten past the steps, but Kirkland was allowed to address Kershaw there. And maybe that's what Jones is telling us, is that other people would have if they had gotten permission.
Yeah, and I could imagine if too many people went over that wall, the Union might have thought that another assault might be happening or something.
Yeah, or that they were trying to trick them into
Right.
Thinking that they were out there helping people, and they really weren't. It was dangerous enough, to go out by himself, for Kirkland to go out onto the field by himself. But I think it would have been more so had he been accompanied by someone who went with him from man to man.
Right. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. I appreciate you being here today.
Okay.
Thanks for that question.
Hey, Laura. Hey, Laura.
Hey.
I finally made it. I'm fashionably late. I'm sorry.
Oh, Dennis. Hey, Dennis, how are you?
Hey, I really apologize to everyone. I blew the time. I thought it was at 5, and I checked my email about 20 minutes ago and went, oh no.
Oh,
So,
it's okay. You missed
I-
the part where I said thank you so much
I
for our fun times we've been having together working on this.
Yeah, I sincerely apologize for being late.
Have you
One
had
of
fun
those
working on it as
things.
much as I have, or is it just me?
Say again.
I said, have you had fun working on it, or was it just me?
Oh, no, I dropped a project I've been working on for 20 years and got involved with this with Laura going on 3 years ago now. Can you believe that? It's been almost 3 years since we started this, and it's been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot.
It has been, and so many people have been so helpful to us. Thank you for going out there on the ground and reconciling those reports in the ground that you walked on, and so many people have been so helpful. Frank O'Reilly with the National Park Service and the Central Rappahannock Heritage Center. Who else, Dennis?
The American Battlefield Trust, the National Park Service, Alan Poe, Tom Elmore. You mentioned Frank O'Reilly, and Mac Waskoff has just gotten involved with us on this, and I think it's going to lead to better things, although I don't know how it can get a lot better than what it is now.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Yeah, I mentioned Mac earlier, and thanked him so much for being willing to review this presentation and the research that went into it. So we're looking forward to his input and advice, and hopefully we can continue to make it better. And maybe we'll have a engagement to go to Columbia, South Carolina in the spring and present this somewhere. That'd be great.
Yeah, it would be.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much, Diane, for having me this afternoon. I enjoyed it and appreciate you having me, and everybody's questions were fantastic. Great questions.
Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us. We really appreciate it. The research that has gone into this is just amazing, as everyone has already mentioned, and we're so glad that Dennis was able to join us and give us some insight himself, and we just look forward to the next great things that y'all are doing. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Thanks, everybody.
Y'all have a great day.